To quote the great and wonderful Neil Jostin, I'm fine. I'm not. I'm not fine at all. Hello everybody, it is Katie here. So it has been a while since I've uploaded a video to this channel. The reasons for which are definitely too long and in-depth to explain at the start of a video with an actual topic, so I'm definitely going to leave that for some sort of life update video. So all I'm going to say for now is hello, welcome back. It has been a time, let's just go with that. But the reason why I'm back with this rather than some sort of update video is because I am finally making a video that I have been meaning to make for the past 5 years. I am finally going to be discussing the All for the Game series. So to give you a little bit of backstory, I first picked up All for the Game back in 2016. So basically, before this past year, 2016 was probably my worst mental health year. There wasn't any specific reason for why it was sort of like a mixture of a bunch of things, but I definitely felt very overwhelmed by life. I was struggling to feel like I had a place to belong at that time. I know I had a lot of issues with my reading and my blog at that point. My blog was something that I'd been focusing on for about 5 years at that point, and things had just started to change where people weren't reading blogs as much. Twitter had become more of a place to talk about books. I got into a few cliques and Twitter group chats for the first time, and it shook things up for me, and I'm not going to go into detail, but I ended up feeling bad about myself. My friendships were shifting during that year. My anxiety was getting a lot worse. I just felt really stuck in a rut, and I had a lot of personal issues going on, and yeah, it wasn't a good year. So during that year, instead of just reading books to review like I mostly was at that time, I decided to stop focusing on my blog for a little while and actually pick up books that I just wanted to read for fun. I wanted to delve into some exciting series because I was looking for a distraction. And so I turned to the book community on Tumblr, which had originally been one of the first book communities I had been part of, but I kind of pulled myself away from that over those years. But in 2016 I went back there and I was asking for book recommendations, and that is how I found The Raven Cycle. And if anybody was on book Tumblr at that time, they will know that there were a few stories that were pushed around onto people together as a collective set, even though those books had absolutely nothing in common other than the fact that they had LGBTQ plus characters. And we were all so starved of representation that we were just looking for anything we could get our hands on, and so there were certain books that were going around. The Raven Cycle was one, Aristotle and Dante, Captive Prince, which I'm definitely going to do a video on at some point, and the Foxhole Court. So I picked up the Raven Cycle first and absolutely loved it, and yeah, it was the perfect escapism I needed, helped me get away from my problems for a little bit. And then I had a mutual on Tumblr recommend me All for the Game. And Tumblr tends to be a lot more cautious than other forms of social media, so she did warn me and completely prepare me before going into these books, just so you know. It wasn't a light-hearted recommendation. But I picked them up, went through a whirlwind of emotions several times. I was like, what the fuck am I reading? I considered putting it down. I carried on. By the third book I knew that it was one of my favourite series of all time, and genuinely it's one of my favourite memories from 2016. So the weird thing about me is that when it comes to series, when they end, I normally don't pick them up again. It's not because I don't love them, because I still absolutely adore them, but I just generally don't do rereads of series. I don't know why. It's weird. I wish I wasn't like that. But after the year that I've had, if you've seen any of my previous videos from the past year, then you will know that I've had the worst year of my life. I haven't necessarily been in a reading slump. My reading's actually been really great this year, but I just craved familiarity, and so I desperately wanted to go back to this trilogy for the first time. Considering I picked it up in a dark place in 2016, since I was going through such a hard time this year, I wanted to pick it up again, and I did. I need to do rereads more often, because my biggest fear about rereads is that reading them again, I won't love them as much. It was the exact opposite with this. If possible, I absolutely adored it 100 times more. And I loved it the first time around. I think this time I just had the chance to fully appreciate everything that these books had to offer. It hit me a lot more emotionally, and I think that's probably because I've had these characters in my life for 5 years now. I know them a lot more, whereas the first time I read it, I read the trilogy in the space of about 3 months, so I hadn't known them that long. So it definitely hit different this time around. So for those of you who haven't read the Foxhole Court, this is a series that I genuinely don't recommend to people unless I know them well. I've only ever recommended it truly to my best friend and my sister and my mum, because she'll read literally anything. Whenever I post about it online, I always do post it with the warning that it is not something you should go into lightly. These books are very, very dark. It is a self-published trilogy, so it hasn't been through the same screening processes that traditionally published books would have gone through. I mean, Nora really did just pour her heart and soul into these stories. It felt like a story that she just had to tell and get out there no matter what. So they're easily accessible because I think they're still free on Amazon. At least they were for me when I picked them up, and then when my sister picked them up 2 years ago, they were still free at that point. I'm not sure if they still are. They're easily accessible, but they're definitely not something you should go into lightly. So there is a huge list of trigger warnings for this book. Listing them all out would actually just take up this whole video, so I've left a link down in the description to somebody who has listed them all on a post. So there is the list of trigger warnings, and then below that there is more of an in-depth look at them, which might spoil a little bit of the plot, but it means that you go in fully prepared if you need to be warned about things before you start reading. Generally, there's not many topics that I won't read about or that I feel like I need to be warned about, but even I'm glad that I got prepared for these books. Those sort of discussions happen more on Tumblr than they do on, say, like Instagram and Twitter, because over the past few years I've noticed that a lot of people post very aesthetically pleasing pictures of these books and it draws people in, but nobody warns them about the true content of this story. Whereas because I first discovered them on Tumblr, I think there's a lot of open discussions about that, so I went in more prepared than other people do. So if you haven't read this story and you are considering it, then please definitely look at the trigger warnings first. To summarise it, I would say the biggest one within this is rape and sexual assault. There is a very, very brutally dark scene at the end of the second book that has stuck with me so much since I first read it. It's a scene that's always going to be in my mind, and I feel like that's the scene that people need preparing for the most. And then the major issue that I have with the books that I've never really been able to forgive. It's not really spoilery to the overall plot, but I always feel like I have to warn people about this because it's a scene that I really just don't like. One of the main characters is drugged and kissed against their will, and that scene, I love this series so much, but I've never been able to forgive that scene and I hate it, and I just don't think the kissing was necessary. I mean, there are reasons behind the drugging and I don't condone that at all. I still think that's awful, but these characters are very messed up. They are very morally grey, and in a twisted way, the drugging of the character makes sense in the plot, but the kissing never did, and yeah, that still doesn't sit right with me, so I always tell people about that. And the other main trigger warnings are the extreme violence, that it goes very in depth because gangs are involved, and yeah, they're the main issues. So for those of you who haven't read the Foxhole Court, I always warn people about the problems within it before actually talking about the plot, because I don't want to draw people in with an exciting sounding plot and then be like, oh, by the way, guess what? So now that we've got the dog stuff out of the way, to tell you a bit about the plot, the All for the Game series is focused on a fictional sport called Exy. It's quite similar to lacrosse, but it's played inside a huge court, and the fans for this sport are on par with football fans for us. It's a huge college sport. These characters are all in Palmetto State University. That's who they play for. So the main character, Neil, his father is a terrible man. He's known as the Butcher of Baltimore. When the story starts, he's currently in prison, but Neil is still on the run from him. The majority of his life has been spent running away from his father, but he loves playing Exy, and that's his whole world. He gets offered the chance to play with the Foxes, and against his better judgment, he joins them. And in terms of a spoiler-free summary, that's really all I'm going to say, because the main reason I made this video is to discuss why I love this crazy messed up story as much as I do. So if you haven't read these books, that's it, that's all I'm gonna say. For everyone who has read these books, whether you loved it or hated it, let's discuss. So as you know by now, I never structure my videos. Even though I've planned to make this video for 5 years, I still don't actually have a plan. I'm literally just going to jump in and discuss the most important aspects of it to me. I'll try not to waffle on for too long. So first and foremost, I am wearing a Palmetto State Foxes sweater. I don't know how well you can see it on the camera. So I've been getting into fabric painting over the past couple of years, and I've always wanted a Foxes sweater, but I never seem to find one within my price range because shipping prices on Etsy can be a lot. So I had an orange sweater and decided to paint one myself. The logo is something that I designed myself as well. I'm hoping to put it on Redbubble at some point. And of course on the back, I have Mignard, my favourite little psychotic book character. Andrew genuinely created a blueprint for the type of character that I have been drawn to since 2016. He has influenced my taste in character so much. So not to jump right in at the final book, but that's where we're going. Because as I mentioned earlier, emotionally, this ruined me. I mean, I teared up the first time I read it, but I don't think I like really cried. This time, I cried a lot. So I was a mess at the end of the second book when Neil goes to Evermore, and it's the emotion of knowing that he's doing this to help others at this point. He's finally found people that he cares about and a place to belong, so he goes through all of this for them and for himself to keep playing with them a bit longer. And we delve more into that in this book, and just seeing Neil's layers come undone and his walls being torn down, it's so beautiful and heart-wrenching, and I just appreciated it so much more in this book. By the time I got to the scene where he's taken by Lola, I was an absolute mess. The scenes leading up to that, where he's getting closer with Andrew and he's getting more attached to the Foxes, and he's just in a really good place. They play a game, they win, and then suddenly it all gets taken away from him in one phone call from Lola. And when he says that line to Andrew, the "you were amazing" line, and in his head he's thanking him for the kisses and for the honesty, and just I was crying at that point, and I knew that I was going to cry throughout the rest of chapter 12. I mean, I remembered how brutal it was, but I just didn't expect it to hit me so much this time around. Like I said before, it was definitely in part because I'd known the characters for longer this time. The first time I read it, it was more shock than anything else, because I was reading it for the first time and I was like, oh my god, what the fuck is happening? Whereas this time around, I already knew what had happened because I'd read it before, so I was truly able to focus more on the emotions of the scene. And yeah, it was brutal. It wrecked me. So I tend not to like tab books the way other people do, but I just have to talk about the paragraph that stuck out to me the most, and it's probably a paragraph that has affected me more than anything else I've read in my life. So when he's being tortured, he decides to shut Lola out and just think about the Foxes and everything that he's gained in the past year. The part that got me the most was he'd hit the end of his rope before he wanted to, and he hadn't accomplished everything he'd hoped to this year, but he'd done more with his life than he'd ever thought possible. That had to be enough. But the line that just got me the most was he traced the outline of a key into his bloody burnt palm with a shaky finger, closed his eyes and wished Neil Jostin goodbye. Why? Why did you think that was okay to write, Nora? What? That line has been burnt into the back of my mind since I reread it. I'm just never going to get over it. Like, it had an impact on me the first time, but this time, oh my god. Now that I feel like I know Neil more thoroughly, especially because after reading it the first time, I went through Nora's blog and read all of the extra content that she posted and all of that. You know, I've seen tons of fan art since. I've read people's headcanons. I know Neil. He's just such a familiar character to me. To see him fully come undone like that and shut everything out, and just he breaks down in that moment. That is genuinely one of the most beautiful things that I've ever read in a book. And despite all of the problems that this series has, because it does have its problems, I just think that those scenes and the way they're written, they really make everything worthwhile, because it's just some of the most gorgeous writing in existence. This whole video could just be about that one scene. It was brutal, but it was beautiful. And what's horrible after that I remember affecting me the first time, but definitely affected me more this time as well, was the fact that he refers to himself as Nathaniel from that point on, until Andrew tells him that he can be Neil again, and that he never has to be anybody other than Neil. Those scenes... I don't know why I decided to make a video when I actually don't have words to convey the emotions that those scenes brought out in me. What I definitely appreciated more during this reread is that that all goes down kind of just over the halfway point of the book, because even though there are still a lot of things to deal with after that, like the final game against the Ravens, the fallout with Rico, and everything else, the major brutal climax of Neil coming face to face with his father, which is something we've been waiting for throughout the whole series, it happens there so that we have all this time to wrap things up properly. And I love that so much, because a lot of the time in series I always feel really rushed at the end, and I'm always looking at the amount of pages left thinking, how are we going to deal with everything in this little amount of time? Most of the time we don't deal with everything, and that's why endings are always such a bittersweet thing for me, because I like to have an in-depth look at situations after something major happens, and that is considered the major event in this book because it's been leading up to that. So before that final game with the Ravens, we get to go over everything else. We get to see how Andrew and Neil's relationship changes from that point on. We get Kevin looking at Neil, seeing how he's overcome this, and being inspired to take matters into his own hands as well. He changes his tattoo, he tells Wymack that he's his father, he leaks that information to the press so that the attention is on him as well as Neil. I love the pacing of this book. I just think it's so perfect. And yeah, by the time you get to that ending and that final game, you feel satisfied. The important conversations have been had and that you know where things are going. I love this final book with my whole heart. It's probably one of my favourite conclusions to a series ever for the way that it's been written and paced out. So the main thing I wanted to discuss, other than how much I've cried for Neil over the past few weeks, is the relationship between Andrew and Neil. It's one of my favourite fictional relationships that I've ever read. It ticks all the boxes for me. One of the things that I love about this series is that the relationship isn't a big part of the story until that final book. Their interactions as characters are important. Like, they are the most important people to each other in terms of how they progress in the story. But the romantic side of the relationship doesn't come into it until the final book, when Andrew's off his meds. So it's the definition of a slow burn romance, and I absolutely love that, because there's nothing I hate more than a romance that's rushed into. The build up to Andrew and Neil becoming something more is just so important. So the most important part of this story for me is the consent between Andrew and Neil, and that's something that I've always wanted to discuss in a video anyway, because a lot of people talk about the problems within these stories, because I'm not going to deny that they're there, but I don't think enough people talk about how important that level of consent between those two characters is, because I absolutely love the way that it's handled. Obviously, Andrew has experienced some of the most brutal attacks on himself, and Neil is aware of that. You know, his romantic advances towards Andrew after Andrew kisses him, like, he always thinks about that and he never ever crosses a line. The whole yes and no thing that they have going on between them, it is just so beautiful, and it struck out to me so much that it set a bar for everything that I read afterwards. It's just the way that Neil is always waiting for that green light from Andrew, and he always lets Andrew dictate the way things are going to move forward, and it's just something that I've always loved about this series, and it shows us a completely different side to these two characters that we've been reading about this whole time, and I think that's why I love their relationship so much. I also love the absolute change in Andrew from the first two books to the last one, when he comes off his meds. That's why I love the third book so much, because their interactions feel so much more genuine, and Neil learns a lot more about Andrew. Still, one of the absolute funniest scenes in any book ever is the scene in Colombia when Roland sees the handcuff marks on Neil. Neil saying to Andrew, "Why does Roland think you're tying me down?" And Andrew giving his whole "I hate you, but it doesn't mean I wouldn't blow you" scene. Nothing can be that funny. Nothing. Neil's mind just goes haywire in those moments that are completely different to the Neil we see any other time. It's just so funny to read. I also love the conversation that Neil has with Renee about Andrew's sexuality in the second book, because everybody's convinced that Andrew and Renee are gonna be a thing, and so is Neil. And Neil starts getting more and more frustrated about it, so by the time he talks to Renee, he's kind of like accusing her. He's like, "Why aren't you dating Andrew? Why is this not a thing?" And Renee's like, "Because I'm a woman." And Neil's brain, it just stops for like a few minutes, and then it's automatically like, "Oh, so he's with Kevin then." How can somebody who survived this long be so dumb in certain situations? Wymack figured it out before he did. Those scenes are also hilarious at the start of the third book, when Wymack knows that there's like something between them, and he's constantly saying things to Neil like, "Don't let this get in the way of things." He's pushing Neil towards Andrew to help Andrew interact with the others more, and Neil's kind of just like, "What do you mean?" It's so funny. Bless Neil. Not a thought behind those eyes. So yeah, I have a million and one things about Andrew and Neil that I could discuss, but we would literally be here all day, so I'm trying to just like summarize things quickly. But I will just simply say that Andrew and Neil is genuinely one of my favourite relationships in any book I've ever read. So let's talk about the person who is obviously my favourite character. It's Andrew. Surprise! It's this little boy right here. It's very difficult to explain my love for Andrew. When I picked up the book for the first time, I knew that people loved Andrew because I always saw art of him. I had trusted mutuals who loved him, and I was like, well, if they love him, I'm going to love him. And then I delved into the story and I was like, what the fuck is wrong with you people? Why do you love this man? And it was just funny that a couple of years later, when my sister read the books, she knew that I loved Andrew at that point, and I got to watch the same thing happen to her, in which she started reading these books and was like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why do you love this man so much? And I was kind of having to be just like, oh, wait until you get to the end of the second book and, you know, everything becomes clear. He has been through a lot, and he is a very, very morally grey character. He does things that you can't really defend him against. He does a lot of things that he has genuine reasons for, that, you know, he sees as the only way to get from point A to B. He is messed up, but this series still made me love him so much. He is the type of character that will throw a young defenseless woman against a wall in order to intimidate her. Sometimes he has no barriers. When it comes to the people that he cares about, nothing will stand in his way. Yeah, there are a lot of instances where you're kind of like, yeah, I can't defend him for this. Regardless of all of that, I absolutely love him. His character is one of the most interesting characters that I've ever read about. It's so beautiful to see how Neil changes him in that final book as well. He starts learning to let his guard down a little bit. And there were so many just gorgeous moments between the two of them that I really appreciated. Like the ride on the bus where they talk to each other properly and open up to each other for the first time. There's the moments in which Neil is just looking at Andrew, just appreciating him, and in those moments that kind of like the indicator for Neil that, you know, these feelings run a little bit deeper than just kissing each other on a roof occasionally. Yeah, I can't really explain why I love everything about them so much, but I just do. I've waffled on so much about Andrew and Neil that I don't really have time for the other characters, but I do. I love all of the characters. Not all of them. I don't love Rico, obviously. But I love the other foxes. I love Renee. She's literally one of my favourite characters in this whole series. I absolutely adore her friendship with Andrew, and learning more about why they trust each other is such a beautiful part of the story. It was so interesting doing this reread because it made me love characters that I didn't really appreciate the first time around. It's not that I didn't like them, I just didn't love them. One of those characters being Matt. The first time I read the series, I don't really remember thinking much about Matt, whereas rereading it, I appreciated him so much more. He's just such an angel. And then of course there's Kevin. What can I say about Kevin? What a funny little man he is. He's so interesting. There's a scene that I really loved in the third book when they go on a vacation together to the cabin. Four of the other characters are sitting in the hot tub and then Kevin's just sitting at the side reading a history book. I loved him in that moment. I love how he has little breakdowns every now and then, especially every time Neil opens his mouth and Kevin's just like, oh, that's it. We're gonna die now. You've done it. There's just so many interactions between different characters that I absolutely adore. When it comes to favourite scenes, a lot of my favourite scenes are Neil trash talking Rico, by the way, in case that wasn't obvious. Every time Rico is within Neil's vicinity, the others are just like, please don't say a word. Neil's like, okay, I won't. But anyway, there's one line where he says something along the lines of, well, if I'm in my coffin anyway, then I might as well nail it shut, and then just continues to rip into Rico. It's so beautiful. Because Neil, the whole story is about Neil being like, what can I do to survive? This is what I need to do in order to live. I've got to keep my head down, I've got to change my look, change my name, keep myself hidden, and then Rico appears and Neil just snaps. All of his instincts just disappear and he has to say shit. It's just gorgeous. I'm running out of time on the camera, so I'm gonna have to start wrapping things up, even though I've only just scratched on the surface of what I love about this series. But I did want to just talk about how this definitely changed my reading, because when my mutual on Tumblr first recommended it to me, she pitched it as a sports story, and immediately I was like, oh well, no, I'm not going to enjoy it if it's about sports. Unless it's about figure skating, which is my favourite sport. I'm generally not a sports person, so I didn't think I would enjoy a story that focuses so heavily on sport. The Foxhole Court changed everything about my reading tastes, because I loved reading about a sport, even if it was fictional. In fact, I think I loved it more because it was fictional. Like, I just love the concept of creating a sport for a story. But I realised when reading it that I love the dynamics of a team, and so ever since that series I have sought out stories that revolve around sports, and some of my favourite stories of all time I have read because of the Foxhole Court, which is just an example of how sometimes you should step out of your comfort zones when it comes to stories, because you literally never know. So I've already delved a little into like the biggest issues I had with the story. Yeah, there are definitely problematic things that I can't really defend. You know, there are slurs that are used throughout the story. There are things that are said that just really aren't necessary. And yet, like, this is a series that's definitely not without its problems. But those problems don't take away my overall enjoyment. I just don't defend those issues. Whenever I do discuss the Foxhole Court, there are people that really just don't like it at all. I don't ever shut them down and try to talk over them and be like, oh, but you're missing the point. Like, no, if you have problems with this series, then that's absolutely fine. I don't blame you. I still have problems, but I also still love the story, and yeah, I hold it so close to my heart. So rereading it 5 years on, I didn't expect to love it more, and yet here we are. It's crazy how a story that's so dark can also be a story that somebody takes such comfort in. But that was definitely the case during this reread, and I just love these characters and the environment of this story so much. Yeah, I have a lot of love. These books mean the world to me, and I am so glad that I picked them up and gave them a chance. And it's great to see that 5 years later, I still love them even more so. If you have read these books, then please feel free to discuss every single intricate part of them with me down in the comments. So just unleash all of your thoughts. If you like bookish playlists, then I made an All for the Game playlist on my Spotify, a link to which I will drop in the description for all of your Andrew and Neil feels. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you next time. Bye!